Henry VIII once revered John Houghton as a living saint, yet ultimately decreed for him the most horrific death imaginable, being disemboweled while fully conscious and breathing. The king intended for Houghton to witness his own entrails being ripped out and cast into the fire at Tyburn, a savage punishment tailored for the man who dared to deny royal supremacy. The height of savagery arrived when the executioner reached into Houghton's torn-open chest to grasp his still-beating heart, yet Houghton uttered no scream of agony. Possessing an eerie calm, he simply whispered a final question that made even the man holding the blade tremble. "Lord Jesus, what will you do with my heart?" Today we examine this blood-soaked, tragic moment in English history, where sheer courage triumphed over unbearable physical pain. By 1535, King Henry VIII was desperate for a male heir to secure his dynasty. He decided to leave Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn, a move that required breaking away from the Pope's authority. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church in England and demanded that all his subjects swear an oath of absolute loyalty to his new title. While politicians and wealthy bishops surrendered to save their lives and fortunes, the Carthusian monks stood firm. Based at the London Charterhouse, these men were respected by everyone for their strict discipline and genuine holiness. Unlike the rest of the clergy, they could not be bought with money or threatened with poverty, as they already lived with nothing. This resistance presented a dangerous problem for the king. Because the public viewed John Houghton and his monks as the moral gold standard of England, their refusal to sign the oath undermined Henry's authority. The king needed their endorsement to legitimize his new powers. If they would not bow to his will, he knew he had to eliminate them. John Houghton was born around 1487 in Essex to a solid, wealthy background. The details of his early life are sparse, as is common with men who seek to hide themselves in history, but we know he was brilliant. He attended Cambridge University, a hotbed of the new learning. He earned a doctorate in laws and theology. In a different life, Houghton could have been a powerful bishop or a wealthy statesman. His parents had a typical path mapped out for him: a strategic marriage, a comfortable estate, and a quiet life of luxury. Houghton ran in the opposite direction. When his parents tried to arrange a marriage for him, he fled. He didn't just run away, he ran to the hardest life he could find. He sought a life that would strip him of his ego layer by layer. He was ordained a secular priest first, but he found the life of a parish priest too distracting, too immersed in the world. He craved the great silence. In 1515, at the age of 28, he entered the London Charterhouse. The initiation into the Carthusian order is designed to break a man's will. The postulant is tested. Can he handle the solitude? Can he handle the silence? Many men cracked. The isolation of the cell can drive a man mad if he is not spiritually grounded. It forces you to confront the darkest parts of your own mind without distraction. There is no conversation to drown out your thoughts. There is no alcohol, no entertainment, no escape, just you and God. Houghton thrived. He didn't just endure the austerity, he embraced it. He disappeared into the rhythm of the Charterhouse. Between the pillars of prayer, matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, vespers in the evening, he worked in his cell, copied manuscripts, and meditated. He rose through the ranks not because he was ambitious. Ambition is a sin in a monastery, but because he was competent. He served as the sacristan, caring for the holy vessels. He served as the procurator, the man who had to break the silence to deal with the outside world, handling the finances and buying the food. This was a burden for him. He hated leaving the silence, but he did it out of obedience. By 1531, he was elected prior, the head of the entire community. People who knew him described him as angelic. In hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, this term is thrown around loosely, but in Houghton's case, the contemporary accounts are specific. They describe a man of immense gentleness. He was humble to a fault. Despite being the prior, the CEO of the monastery, he would often do the lowest chores. If a monk was sick, Hooton would empty his chamber pot. If the floor needed scrubbing, Hooton was on his knees. He would wash the feet of his subordinates. Physically, he was described as small, slight of build, worn thin by years of fasting. His skin was pale from the lack of sun, but his eyes possessed an intense intelligence. He was a man who listened more than he spoke. He was a man who exuded a calm that unnerved the noisy, chaotic world outside. For the first few years of his leadership, the relationship between the Charterhouse and the Crown was peaceful. The monks prayed for the king. The king protected the monks. It was the ancient feudal bargain. But the storm of the king's great matter, the royal divorce, was brewing on the horizon. The tectonic plates of history were shifting. In 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen. The Pope refused to recognize the marriage. Henry was excommunicated. The first direct strike against the Charterhouse came in 1534. The king's commissioners arrived at the monastery gates. They were not soldiers yet. They were bureaucrats. They brought with them the Act of Succession. This law declared that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid, that his marriage to Anne Boleyn was valid, and that their children were the true heirs to the throne. The commissioners demanded that every monk sign the act. Houghton was in a bind. He didn't want to get involved in politics. He gathered his community. He told them that the king's marriage was a matter for the world, not for the cloister. He simply wanted to be left alone to pray. When the commissioners demanded his signature, Hooton hesitated. He told them, "It is not my vocation to meddle in the king's business." But the state does not tolerate neutrality. In a totalitarian system, silence is not consent. Silence is defiance. The commissioners arrested Houghton and the procurator, Humphrey Middlemore. They were marched through the streets of London and thrown into the Tower. This was Houghton's first taste of the king's wrath. He spent a month in prison. It was a warning shot. While in the Tower, he was visited by other churchmen, men who had already compromised. They argued with him. They told him that the Act of Succession was just about succession, about who gets the crown next. It wasn't a religious dogma. They told him he was being stubborn, that he was endangering his monks for a legal technicality. Houghton, ever the humble man, began to doubt himself. Was he being proud? Was he risking his brothers' lives for his own stubbornness? Eventually he agreed to sign, but he added a condition, a dangerous, subtle condition. He signed the document, but he added the Latin phrase, Quatinus lex Christi patitur. As far as the law of Christ allows, it was a loophole. He was saying, I will obey the king unless the king contradicts God. The commissioners, desperate to get the signature and move on, accepted it. They released him. Houghton walked back to the Charterhouse. The monks were relieved to see their father return. But Houghton was not relieved. He knew this was only a temporary reprieve. He knew the king would not be satisfied with a conditional loyalty. He gathered his monks in the chapter house. He looked at their faces, young men, old men, men who had trusted him to lead them to God. He spoke to them with a prophetic heaviness. Our hour is not yet come, he told them, but it is coming. He knew that the next demand would not be about succession. It would be about supremacy. It would require them to deny the Pope, and on that point, there could be no loophole. The foreboding silence that settled over the Charterhouse was not merely the absence of noise, but the holding of breath before a scream. Houghton's prophecy to his monks was about to be fulfilled with terrifying speed. As 1534 turned to 1535, the legislative machinery in Westminster ground into gear, producing a law that would erase the gray areas of compromise and force every soul in England to choose between the king's favor and the king's wrath. The time for loopholes and conditional signatures was over. The time for the red line had arrived. The year 1534 turned into 1535, and the atmosphere in London shifted from anxiety to dread. The temporary truce that John Houghton had bought with his conditional signature, as far as the law of Christ allows, was about to be shattered. In November 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. This was the legislation that changed England forever. It declared that the king justly and rightly is and ought to be the supreme head of the Church of England. There were no qualifications. There were no loopholes. The Pope was erased from the legal structure of the kingdom. But Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell knew that declaring a law was one thing, enforcing it was another. They needed a weapon to ensure compliance. So they passed a companion law, the Treasons Act of 1534. This act was a legal nightmare. Previously, treason was defined as an overt act, plotting to kill the king, raising an army, or counterfeiting coin. The new act made words treason. To maliciously wish, will, or desire by words or writing to deprive the king of his titles was now a capital offense, punishable by death. If you said, "The king is not the head of the church," you were dead. If you stayed silent when asked to affirm it, that could be interpreted as malicious silence. John Houghton read the signs. He sat in his cell at the Charter House, the cold winter wind rattling the windows, and he knew the end had come. The loophole he had used before, as far as the law of Christ allows, would no longer work. The new law explicitly contradicted the law of Christ, as the Carthusians understood it. They believed the Pope was the vicar of Christ. To deny him was to deny the faith. Hooton was not a man who sought death. He agonized over this. He looked at his community, men who had joined to pray, not to be martyrs. He felt a father's terrifying responsibility. If he stood firm, they would all die. If he submitted, they would all be damned. In early 1535, realizing that the royal commissioners would soon arrive to demand the oath of supremacy, Houghton gathered his community. The scene described in the Carthusian Chronicles is one of the most moving in religious history. Houghton stood before his monks in the chapter house. He was weeping. "I'm not afraid for myself," he told them. "I'm ready to go to the fire or the axe, but I'm afraid for you. You are young. You are innocent. How can I watch you be destroyed?" He initially proposed a desperate idea. He would go alone to the executioner, offering his life in exchange for theirs. He hoped that if the prior refused the oath, the government might be satisfied with his death and leave the younger monks alone. But the community refused. They cried out, "Let us die together in our integrity." Realizing that they needed to prepare for death, Houghton organized a 3-day spiritual retreat, a triduum, to fortify their souls for the violence that was coming. On the first day, the monks engaged in a general confession, spending the entire day examining their lives and confessing every sin, no matter how small, to ensure they were in a state of grace. The second day, designated as the Day of Reconciliation, witnessed a display of profound humility as the monks, from the oldest scholar to the youngest novice, knelt before one another to ask forgiveness for any slight, harsh word or moment of impatience. The chapter house was filled with the sound of weeping as these men who lived in silence broke that silence to heal their brotherhood. Finally, on the third day, They celebrated the Mass of the Holy Spirit to pray for strength, and according to the accounts of survivor Dom Maurice Chanty, a soft whisper of air, a celestial sound, was heard by everyone during the elevation of the host, bringing with it a sudden overwhelming infusion of peace and courage. They were ready. They were no longer a group of frightened men. They were a legion. In April 1535, Houghton decided not to wait for the knock on the door. He decided to take the initiative. Two other Carthusian priors were visiting London at the time, Robert Lawrence, prior of Beauvale, and Augustine Webster, prior of Axholme. They had come to consult with Houghton on business, but they quickly realized they had walked into a war zone. The three priors decided to go directly to the source of the danger. They walked from the Charterhouse to the Rolls Chapel near Chancery Lane to seek an audience with Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was at the height of his power. He was the king's vicegerent in spirituals. He was the hammer of the monasteries. When the three monks in their white habits were ushered into his presence, the contrast was stark. On one side, the velvet-clad, jewel-fingered politician. On the other, the gaunt, fasting ascetics. Houghton spoke for the group. He was respectful but firm. He did not come to argue theology. He came to ask for an exemption. "We are not rebels," Houghton said. "We are loyal subjects of the king in all temporal matters. We pray for him daily, but we cannot swear this oath because it violates the laws of the Holy Church. We ask only to be left in our silence to pray." Cromwell looked at them with cold, bureaucratic disdain. He did not see holy men. He saw obstacles. He saw defiance that could spread like a virus. "I care nothing for your silence," Cromwell reportedly snapped. "I care for your obedience. Will you swear the oath?" "We cannot," Houghton replied. "Then you are traitors," Cromwell said. He did not let them leave. He ordered their immediate arrest. There was no time to say goodbye to their monks. There was no time to pack a bag. Houghton, Lawrence, and Webster were marched out of Cromwell's office and taken directly to the Tower of London. The Tower of London was a place of damp stone and despair. The three priors were not thrown into a dungeon initially, but kept in a room where they could be interrogated. Cromwell sent his agents to break them. They argued, threatened, and cajoled. They used the classic technique, "Why do you think you are right when all the bishops of England say you are wrong? Are you holier than the Archbishop of Canterbury? Are you wiser than the universities?" It was a powerful psychological attack. It is difficult to stand alone against the consensus of your entire society, but Houghton held his ground. "The king may make laws for England," he argued, "but he cannot change the laws of God that have stood for 1,500 years. The church is universal. England is but a corner of it." They also brought in a fourth prisoner to join them, Richard Reynolds. Reynolds was not a Carthusian. He was a Brigittine monk from Sion Abbey. He was one of the most brilliant scholars in England, a man fluent in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. He was known as the Angel of Sion. He, too, had refused the oath. So there were four of them, 3 Carthusians and 1 Brigittine. The state had captured the spiritual elite of the nation. On April 28, 1535, the 4 monks were brought to Westminster Hall for trial. The charge was high treason. The trial was intended to be a show trial, a quick public condemnation to prove that no one was above the new laws, but it backfired spectacularly. The monks appeared in the dock wearing their religious habits. They looked weak from prison, but radiated a terrifying calm. When asked to plead, they all pleaded not guilty. They did not deny the facts. They admitted they had refused the oath, but they denied the charge. They argued that they had not acted maliciously. The statute required malicious intent. They argued they had spoken only out of conscience. not malice. The jury was composed of ordinary London citizens. They looked at the men in the dock. They knew the Charterhouse. They knew these men fed the poor and lived lives of utter self-denial. They looked at the prosecutor, then at the monks. The jury retired to consider the verdict. Cromwell expected them to return in minutes. Hours passed. The jury did not return. News began to leak out of the jury room. They were refusing to convict. The jurors argued that it was impossible for such holy men to act maliciously. They were terrified of condemning saints to death. This was a disaster for Cromwell. If a London jury acquitted the Carthusians, the king's act of supremacy would be dead in the water. It would be a public humiliation for the crown. Cromwell was furious. According to historical records, he did something unprecedented. He personally stormed into the jury room. He didn't use legal arguments. He used terror. He told the jurors that if they did not return a guilty verdict, they would find themselves in the dock next. He threatened to destroy their families and their livelihoods. Broken by fear, the jury capitulated. They returned to the hall. Guilty. The Lord Chancellor pronounced the sentence. It was the statutory penalty for high treason, a punishment designed to be the most painful way to leave the world. You are to be drawn on hurdles to the place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck, and being alive cut down, and your privy members to be cut off, and your bowels to be taken out of your belly, and there burned, you being alive, and your head to be cut off, and your body to be divided into 4 quarters, and your head and quarters to be disposed of at Her Majesty's pleasure. Usually when a priest was sentenced to death, the church would perform a ritual of degradation. They would strip the priest of his vestments, scrape his fingers where the anointing oil had been placed, and hand him over to the state as a layman. It was a way of respecting the dignity of the priesthood, even while killing the man. But Henry VIII was in a mood for desecration. He ordered that the degradation be skipped. He wanted them to die as monks. He wanted the white habit of the Carthusians to be dragged through the mud. He wanted the visual symbol of the church to be butchered in public. Hooton and his companions were taken back to the Tower to await the end. The date was set, May 4th, 1535. The king's justice would be served. With the sentence of death pronounced, the legal formalities were stripped away, leaving only the naked brutality of the state. The Tower of London, usually a place of indefinite waiting, became the staging ground for a grim procession. As the morning of May 4th approached, the king's mercy evaporated, replaced by a desire for a spectacle that would scar the collective memory of London. The intellectual battle in the courtroom was finished. The physical battle for the sanctity of the human body was about to begin on the long, muddy road to Tyburn. The morning of May 4th, 1535, dawned gray and cool over London. At the Tower of London, the heavy iron gates groaned open. Usually an execution was a raucous affair. The London mob treated hangings as a form of street theater, a grim holiday where they could jeer at criminals and cheer for the king's justice. But contemporary chroniclers note a strange atmosphere on this particular morning. The men being brought out were not murderers, thieves, or rebels. They were the most respected holy men in the kingdom. John Houghton, Robert Lawrence, Augustine Webster, and Richard Reynolds were brought out into the courtyard. Following the king's spiteful orders, they were still dressed in their religious habits, the stark white wool of the Carthusians and the habit of the Brigittine. They were not allowed to walk. They were strapped onto hurdles. A hurdle was a crude sled, often just a piece of wicker fencing or a few planks of wood nailed together. It had no wheels. It was tied directly to the back of a horse. The prisoners were laid flat on their backs and bound by their wrists and ankles. Their heads were near the horses' hooves. The journey from the Tower to Tyburn, near modern-day Marble Arch, was 3 miles long. It was a journey designed to break the body before the executioner even touched it. The horses dragged the sleds through the unpaved, filth-strewn streets of London. The friction was terrible. The prisoners were bounced over cobblestones, dragged through open sewers, and scraped against mud and rocks. As they rattled through the streets, the white habits turned black with filth. The stones tore at their skin. Yet witnesses described their demeanor as eerily calm. They did not scream or curse. They prayed. High in the bell tower, Thomas More was watching. He knew his time was coming soon. He stood at the window with his daughter, Margaret Roper. Looking down at the monks being dragged like sacks of grain, he said, "Lo, dost thou not see, Meg, that these blessed fathers be now as cheerfully going to their deaths as bridegrooms to their marriage?" More recognized what Henry VIII did not. These men were not victims. They were volunteers. They arrived at Tyburn. The triple tree, the massive triangular gallows capable of hanging multiple men at once, loomed over the crowd. Thousands of people had gathered. There were nobles in velvet, apprentices in leather aprons, and spies in the pay of Thomas Cromwell, watching the faces of the crowd for any sign of sympathy for the traitors. John Houghton was the first to be untied. He stood up, shaken and bruised from the journey, but unbroken. The executioner, often a man who had been pardoned for his own crimes on the condition that he kill for the state, approached him. It was customary for the condemned man to forgive the executioner. Houghton embraced him. He was then ordered to climb the ladder to the cart beneath the beam. A final offer was made. A royal official stepped forward. He told Houghton that even now, at the very edge of death, the king was merciful. If he would just submit, if he would just say the words and acknowledge Henry as supreme head, he would be pardoned. He could go back to his cell. He could live. Houghton looked out at the sea of faces. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I call Almighty God to witness, and all good people, and beseech you all to attest to the same for me in the day of judgment, that being here to die, I declare that it is from no obstinate rebellious spirit that I do not obey the king, but because I fear to offend the majesty of God." He did not attack the king. He did not preach rebellion. He simply stated the hierarchy of his conscience. God first, king second. The thick hemp rope was placed around his neck. It was rough and coarse. The cart was driven away. John Houghton fell. The rope went taut. In a modern hanging, the drop is calculated to snap the neck, causing instant death. But the sentence of hanged, drawn, and quartered was not designed for efficiency. It was designed for agony. The executioner had strict orders. He let Houghton hang only for a moment, just long enough to crush the windpipe, to make him gasp and choke, to bring him to the edge of unconsciousness, but not to kill him. Then the rope was cut. Houghton dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. He was dazed, strangling, but he was fully conscious. He was alive. The drawing began. The executioner stripped off his soiled habit. He lay naked on the wooden block, gasping for air. The executioner took a long, sharp knife. He sliced Houghton's abdomen open from the groin up to the chest. Because of his ascetic life, years of fasting and austerity, Houghton had almost no body fat. His anatomy was laid bare instantly. The executioner reached into the living body. He pulled out the bowels and intestines. To add a final layer of psychological horror, a fire had been lit right next to the block. The executioner threw the internal organs into the fire. Houghton, fully awake, was forced to smell the roasting of his own flesh. It is a level of cruelty that the modern mind struggles to comprehend, but it was legal, statutory, and public. It is at this moment that the historical accounts diverge from the mundane into the miraculous. Catholic tradition and contemporary accounts record that as the executioner was working, as he was literally disemboweling the priest, Houghton did not scream for mercy. He did not beg the king. He reportedly whispered a prayer, audible to those closest to the scaffold. "Good Jesu, what will ye do with my heart?" The executioner then took the knife and cut through the diaphragm to access the chest cavity. He reached in to find the heart. Houghton was still breathing. His body was shuddering in shock, but his will remained fixed. The executioner grasped the heart and tore it out of the chest. It was still beating in his hand. In a final act of contempt, the executioner reportedly rubbed the bloody heart against the dying martyr's face before throwing it into the fire. John Houghton was finally dead. The other priors, Lawrence, Webster, and Reynolds, were forced to watch this. They stood by, awaiting their turn, seeing exactly what was about to happen to them. Not one of them flinched. Not one of them accepted the pardon. They followed their leader to the block one by one until the work was done. The state was not done with John Houghton. The law required the destruction of his identity. His body was chopped into 4 quarters. The executioners boiled the quarters in great cauldrons filled with water, salt, and cumin seeds. This was not a culinary act, it was a preservation technique. The tar and spices would prevent the flesh from rotting too quickly and keep the birds away, allowing the body parts to remain on display for weeks or months. They took the head of John Houghton and spiked it on London Bridge to stare blindly over the Thames. But the most chilling message was reserved for his home. They took one of Houghton's severed arms, bloody and tarred, and nailed it to the main gate of the London Charterhouse. The government believes that the sight of John Houghton's butchered body would be the final word, a period placed at the end of the Carthusian resistance. But as the smoke cleared from Tyburn and the crowds dispersed, Thomas Cromwell discovered a frustrating truth. Martyrdom is often a seed, not a grave. The stubborn silence of the Charterhouse persisted louder than before. Realizing that public violence had only consecrated their cause, the state shifted its tactics from the butcher's knife to the jailer's key, preparing a slower, quieter, and far more agonizing darkness for those who remained. By displaying Houghton's severed arm on the Charterhouse gate, Henry VIII made a fundamental psychological error. The government intended the rotting limb to scream, "Submit or die." But to the monks inside the Charterhouse, the arm was not a warning. It was a relic. It was a piece of a saint. Instead of averting their eyes, the monks would stop at the gate to reverence it. They saw it as a flag of victory. Their prior had conquered the world, the flesh, and the devil. He had passed the test. Now the question hung in the silence of the cloister. Would they be strong enough to follow him? Cromwell, receiving reports that the monks were not breaking, was furious. He realized that a quick shock was not enough. He needed to dismantle the community piece by piece. He shifted his strategy from immediate execution to a slow, grinding war of attrition. He would turn the Charterhouse into a prison and then into a tomb. With Houghton dead, the leadership of the Charterhouse fell to 3 men who had been his closest lieutenants: Humphrey Middlemore, William Exmew, and Sebastian Newdigate. Newdigate is a particularly fascinating figure. Before becoming a monk, he had been a courtier. He was a personal friend of Henry VIII. He had eaten at the king's table, hunted in the king's forests, and worn the king's silks. When he left the court to join the austere Carthusians, the king had been baffled. Now the king felt personally betrayed. Legend suggests that Henry VIII actually visited the Charterhouse in disguise, or perhaps had Newdigate brought to him to try and persuade his old friend. He offered Newdigate life, riches, and a return to royal favor. Newdigate refused. He told the king that he could not trade eternity for a few years of comfort. Cromwell had seen enough. In late May 1535, barely 3 weeks after Houghton's execution, soldiers arrived again. They arrested Middlemore, Exmew, and Newdigate. This time, the treatment was even harsher. They were not just imprisoned, they were chained in the Tower of London in a standing position. Iron collars were placed around their necks and chains around their legs, forcing them to stand upright for days on end, unable to sit or lie down to sleep. It was torture designed to induce psychosis. They spent 2 weeks in this agony. They were offered release if they would just acknowledge the king's supremacy. They refused. On June 19, 1535, the second wave of martyrs was dragged to Tyburn. They underwent the same horrific ritual: hanging, cutting down while alive, disembowelment, and quartering. The special forces of the church were being liquidated, rank by rank. With the leadership decapitated twice, Cromwell moved to crush the rank and file. He appointed commissioners to take over the management of the Charterhouse. These were laymen, rough and unspiritual, who were essentially installed as wardens in a prison without bars. They began a campaign of psychological warfare intended to break the monks' sanity. They cut off the food supply, feeding the monks only enough to keep them alive, but in a state of constant weakness. They confiscated their books. For Carthusians whose lives revolved around reading and prayer, this was a form of intellectual starvation. They disrupted the silence. The commissioners would barge into cells shouting and mocking the monks. They forced the monks to listen to heretical sermons. They brought in preachers who railed against the pope and the superstitions of the monastic life, forcing the monks to sit and listen to their vocation being mocked. Yet the core of the community held. For 2 years, this siege continued. The monks were harassed, starved, and bullied, but the vast majority refused to swear the oath of supremacy. They simply retreated further into their interior castles. By May 1537, Cromwell lost patience. He needed the Charterhouse land and money. He decided to implement the final solution for the London Carthusians. There were 10 monks left who absolutely refused to yield. They were the hard core of the resistance. Cromwell did not want another public spectacle at Tyburn. The crowds were getting restless, and he didn't want to create more martyrs. He decided to kill them quietly, where no one could see. The 10 monks were arrested and marched to Newgate prison. Newgate was a hellhole. It was filthy, disease-ridden, and dark. But the specific punishment devised for these 10 men was uniquely cruel. They were chained to posts in a standing position, their hands tied behind their backs. They were left in the dark, and they were given absolutely no food or water. The order was simple: let them starve to death. It was a clean, bureaucratic way to kill. No blood, no executioner, just silence and time. It is here, in the darkest chapter of the story, that a ray of light appears in the form of a woman named Margaret Clement. Margaret was the adopted daughter of Thomas More. She had known the Carthusians all her life. They had been the spiritual directors of the More family. When she heard that the monks were starving in Newgate, she devised a plan that was as daring as it was compassionate. She bribed the jailer. It was a risky move. If Cromwell found out, she and the jailer would both be executed. But the jailer, perhaps moved by the plight of the monks or simply greedy for gold, agreed to let her in. Disguised as a simple milkmaid with a great pail on her head, Margaret entered the prison. The pail was full of meat and wine. When she reached the cell, she found a horror show. The monks were emaciated, chained, and wallowing in their own filth. Because their hands were tied behind their backs, they could not feed themselves. Margaret Clement washed them. She cleaned their sores. and then she fed them by hand, placing the food into their mouths like a mother feeding infants. For a few weeks the miracle continued. The government officials were baffled. The monks were supposed to be dead by now. Starvation usually kills in a week or two. Yet, these men were still alive, still praying, still holding on. Eventually, the king's council became suspicious. The jailer, terrified for his life, told Margaret she could no longer enter the cell. Margaret was desperate. She pleaded with him. If she couldn't go in, could she at least go to the roof? The jailer agreed. For a few more days, Margaret climbed onto the roof of Newgate Prison. She removed the slate tiles and lowered food down in a basket on a string, trying to drop it near the mouths of the chained men. But it was hopeless. The monks were too weak to move towards the food. The chains were too tight. Margaret Clement had to stop. One by one, the silence of death overtook the cell in Newgate. Between June and September 1537, the monks died of starvation and disease. William Greenwood died first on June 6th. John Davy died on June 8th. Robert Salt died on June 9th. Walter Pearson died on June 10th. Thomas Green died on June 10th. Thomas Scriven died on June 15th. Thomas Reading died on June 16th. The bodies were dragged out and thrown into a common pit. The jailer recorded their deaths as natural causes, a final bureaucratic lie to cover the state's murder. However, one monk, William Horne, refused to die. He survived the starvation. He lay in the filth among his dead brothers, barely breathing, a skeleton wrapped in skin. The government, frustrated that he wouldn't die quietly, finally dragged him out in 1540. He was taken to Tyburn and hanged, drawn, and quartered. He was the last of the London Carthusians. The victory of the state seemed complete. The walls of the Charterhouse were emptied. The silence of prayer was replaced by the noise of looting. The king's men stripped the lead from the roof, melted down the chalices, and turned the sanctuary into a storage house for the king's hunting nets and tents. The fortress of silence had been breached. The defenders were dead. To the eyes of the world, John Houghton and his sons had lost everything. They had been wiped off the face of the earth. But history has a way of turning defeats into victories. The destruction of the Charterhouse was total. But the story of what happened inside Newgate and Tyburn began to leak out. It was whispered in the back alleys of London. It was written down in secret manuscripts and smuggled to Europe. The monks had not saved their building, but they had saved something far more important. They had drawn a line in the sand of history. They had proven that there is a part of the human spirit that no king, no law, and no torture chamber can ever conquer. The silence of the Newgate cell eventually gave way to the silence of the grave, and to all appearances, the victory of Henry VIII was absolute. The monks were dead, the walls were stripped, and the holy ground was partitioned among the wealthy. Yet in the chaos of the dissolution, a single thread of memory managed to slip through the king's fingers. One man, burdened by the guilt of survival, carried the story into exile, ensuring that while the physical Charterhouse was transformed into a playground for the Tudor elite, the spiritual Charterhouse remained indestructible in the pages of history. History is usually written by the victors, but the history of the London Charterhouse was written by a man who considered himself a failure. His name was Dom Maurice Chanty. Chanty was a monk at the Charterhouse during the Terror. He knew John Houghton. He loved him. But when the moment of testing came, when the arm of his prior was nailed to the gate and the king's commissioners demanded the oath, Chanty faltered. He was not one of the 10 who starved in Newgate. He was not one of the 3 who were butchered at Tyburn. He was one of the monks who, broken by fear and confusion, eventually signed the oath of supremacy. He saved his life. The government allowed him to leave the monastery with a small pension. He walked out of the charter house alive, while his brothers were thrown into pits or boiled in tar. But Chanty could not live with the noise of his own survival. He fled England. He wandered across Europe a haunted man, eventually rejoining a Carthusian community in Bruges. He spent the rest of his life in a state of profound penance. He referred to himself as the spotted sheep of the flock. Yet, in a twist of divine irony, it was Chanty's weakness that saved Houghton's strength. Because he survived, he could write. Chanty wrote the Historia Aliquot Martyrum Anglorum, the history of some English martyrs. In this book, he recorded every detail. He wrote down the words Houghton spoke in the chapter house. He described the 3 days of tears. He described the smell of the dungeon and the look on Cromwell's face. If Chanty had been brave enough to die, the story of John Houghton would have died with him. Because he was weak enough to live, the story became immortal. His manuscript was smuggled across Europe, printed in Mainz and Milan, and read by the Pope. It became the primary evidence that would, centuries later, lead to the canonization of his friends. While Chanty was writing in exile, the physical structure of the London Charter House was being subjected to a violent transformation. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell were not just ideological conquerors, they were capitalists. The dissolution of the monasteries was the largest transfer of wealth in English history. The Charter House sat on prime real estate just outside the city walls. The sanctity of the space was aggressively dismantled. The church, the high altar, where Hooton had experienced the soft whisper of the Holy Spirit, was stripped. The silver chalices were melted down to mint coins. The vestments were sold to tailors to be cut up for cushions and curtains. The library. The Carthusians possessed one of the finest libraries in London. The king's men didn't care about theology. They ripped the pages out of illuminated manuscripts to use for gun wadding, to clean boots, or to wrap fish in the market. Centuries of knowledge were wiped out in a week. The cells, the small cottages where the monks had prayed in silence, were turned into storage sheds for the king's hunting equipment. The silence was replaced by the noise of the court. The property was gifted to a succession of wealthy noblemen. It eventually came into the possession of Lord North, and later the Duke of Norfolk. These men turned the House of Prayer into a Tudor mansion. The great cloister, once walked by monks in meditation, was used as a gallery for court gossip. The chapter house, where Houghton had wept for his sons, became a storage room for wine and weaponry. There is a jarring historical irony here. Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom this entire revolution was started, actually stayed at the Charter House before her coronation. She slept in rooms that had been built by the sweat of the martyrs. The halls echoed with the music of the Elizabethan court, masques, dances, and feasts, drowning out the ghostly memory of the chants that had once filled the air. There was one fleeting moment of hope. In 1553, Henry VIII's Catholic daughter, Mary Tudor, came to the throne. She tried to turn back the clock. She invited the Carthusians back. Dom Maurice Chanty, now an old man, returned to London with a handful of survivors. They re-entered the Charter House. They found it wrecked, remodeled, and desecrated, but they tried to restart the rhythm of prayer. For 3 years the silence returned, but Mary died in 1558, and Elizabeth I took the throne. The pendulum swung back. The monks were expelled again, this time forever. Chanty led his little band back into exile, dying in Paris, never seeing his home again. With the physical structure lost and the monks scattered, the memory of John Houghton went underground. In England, to own a picture of John Houghton or a copy of Chanty's book was a crime. It was treason, yet families kept them. The old Catholic families of England, the Recusants, passed the story down like a secret inheritance. They preserved physical relics, a finger of John Houghton, a blood-stained cloth from Tyburn, a rough cross carved by one of the monks in Newgate, but more importantly, they preserved the idea of John Houghton. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as the Enlightenment swept Europe and religion was increasingly seen as a private matter or a superstition, the figure of Houghton stood as a stark reminder of a different worldview. He represented the primacy of conscience. He became a hero not just for Catholics, but for anyone who believed that the state did not have the right to own a man's soul. He was a precursor to the modern concept of civil disobedience. He was a man who said no when the entire world screamed yes. Despite the obvious heroism of Houghton and his companions, the Catholic Church moved with glacial slowness regarding their official sainthood. There were political reasons for this. For centuries, the Vatican was trying to navigate a delicate diplomatic dance with the British Empire. Canonizing the English martyrs was seen as a direct insult to the British Crown. It was effectively declaring that the foundational laws of the British state were criminal. So John Houghton remained in the waiting room of history. He was venerable, then blessed, beatified in 1886 by Pope Leo XIII. But the final step, canonization, remained elusive. It would take the collapse of the British Empire and the changing of the modern world to finally elevate the monk of the Charterhouse to the altars of the universal church. The noise of the 16th century had to fade before the silence of the 20th century could hear him. For centuries, John Houghton stood in the shadows of history, revered in secret by the faithful, but branded a traitor in the official records of the nation that killed him. He was a ghost haunting the conscience of England, his story whispered in back rooms while his home crumbled into ruin. But time has a way of eroding political grudges and revealing spiritual truths. As the empires of the world faded and the modern era emerged, the stage was finally set for the ultimate vindication. The silence that had begun in a medieval cell was about to break into a hymn of glory under the dome of St. Peter's. On October 25, 1970, a scene unfolded in Rome that would have been unimaginable to Henry VIII or Thomas Cromwell. St. Peter's Basilica was packed. The air was filled not with the smell of burning flesh or the stench of Newgate prison, but with incense. Pope Paul VI, seated on the throne of St. Peter, officially canonized the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. Leading this group, the first among equals, was St. John Houghton. The ceremony was a profound closing of the historical circle. 435 years earlier, Houghton had been butchered because he refused to deny the authority of the Pope. Now, a modern pope was declaring him a saint for the universal church. In his homily, Pope Paul VI did not speak of vengeance or political triumph. He spoke of reconciliation. He noted that the England of 1970 was not the England of 1535. The sectarian violence had healed. The canonization was not an attack on the Anglican Church or the British state. It was a celebration of the human capacity for integrity. John Houghton, the man who had been dragged through the mud of London as a traitor, was now raised to the glory of the altars. His name, which the king had tried to erase, was now chanted in the litany of saints. But the legacy of John Houghton is not just found in the Vatican. It is found in the physical stones of London itself. The London Charterhouse did not disappear. It endured a history almost as turbulent as its monks. After the dissolution, it became a mansion for rich noblemen. It hosted Queen Elizabeth I. It became a hospital and a school, Charterhouse School, which later moved, though the site remained. It became a home for brothers, elderly men in need of financial support, returning the site to a form of charitable community. But the 20th century brought a new terror. In 1941, during the Blitz, the German Luftwaffe dropped incendiary bombs on the Charterhouse. The roof caught fire. The Great Hall, the staircase, and the cloisters were gutted. The site where Houghton had prayed was reduced to a smoking ruin, much as it had been spiritually gutted in 1537. It seemed like the end. The damage was catastrophic. But just as the story of the martyrs refused to die, the building refused to fall. After the war, a massive restoration project began. Architects and historians painstakingly rebuilt the Charterhouse, restoring the stones that had witnessed the 3 days of tears. Today, if you walk just north of Smithfield Market, you can still find it. You can walk through the gate where the martyr's arm was nailed. You can stand in the courtyard where the monks were arrested. It is no longer a monastery, but it is still a place of quiet. It is an almshouse, home to a community of elderly men who live together, eat together, and worship in the chapel. The silence has returned, softened by time, but still present. And in the chapel there is a memorial. It marks the spot where John Houghton celebrated Mass, and where the Holy Spirit was said to have descended on the doomed community. Why does a medieval monk matter in the modern world? St. John Houghton is a patron saint for the individual conscience. We live in an age that is often just as loud, just as pressured, and just as demanding of conformity as Tudor England. We face different pressures, not kings with axes perhaps, but the pressure of public opinion, the pressure of the state, the pressure to conform to the current thing or be canceled. Houghton's life proposes a radical idea. There is a line you cannot cross. He was not a rebel by nature. He obeyed the king in everything until the king asked for his soul. At that point, the quiet man became immovable. He teaches us that true strength is not found in aggression. Cromwell was aggressive. Henry VIII was aggressive. They had the swords, the laws, and the armies. Houghton had nothing but his silence. Yet 500 years later, we remember the monk with reverence, while the king is remembered largely for his cruelty and his wives. Houghton proves that integrity is the only thing that truly lasts. You can strip a man of his clothes, his title, his home, and even his heart, but you cannot take his yes or his no unless he gives it to you. The executioner at Tyburn thought he was ending a life. In reality, he was completing a masterpiece. The depiction of St. John Houghton offering his own heart represents one of the most powerful symbols in religious history. It is gruesome, yes, but it is also triumphant. When the executioner shouted, "Behold the heart of a traitor," he was wrong. He was holding the heart of the only free man in London. Henry VIII was a slave to his passions. Cromwell was a slave to his ambition. The jury was a slave to their fear. Only John Houghton was free because he had already given his heart to something that the king could not touch. In the silence of the Charterhouse, John Houghton learned how to die, and in his death he taught the world how to live. The noise of Tudor London has long since faded away. The shouting of the merchants, the clanging of the armor, the roar of the Tyburn crowd, it is all gone. But in the quiet corners of history, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whisper of the Carthusian prior, speaking across the centuries, asking the question that defines his life and challenges ours. Good Jesu, what will ye do with my heart?